Hi there. Let's talk about using the Marquee tool and the Move tool in Photoshop. So what we've got is an image here to start with where we can practice using these tools, and I can explain what they do. I've got two images loaded that we're going to use. I've got this Marilyn Monroe picture and then a picture frame picture. So first, let's look at the Marilyn picture. Now, on your toolbar, you'll see up at the top, you've got a Move tool, and then right below it is the Marquee tool. We have a rectangular marquee, the elliptical marquee, and then the single row and column pixel selection tools. So let's start with just a basic marquee selection. Now, inside Photoshop, what you have to do is you have to select pixels to be able to modify them. So if I'm going to do something to this picture, I need to select the portion of the picture that I'm going to edit. Now, up until now, maybe you've been working with an image and adjusting the entire image all at once. With a Marquee tool, you can protect certain areas of your picture while editing another. Another thing to point out, since this is a basic start, is looking at your sidebar, we have the layer palette open, and that shows us this image is locked. It has a little lock symbol and the background image. This JPEG image is a flattened image. Before I do any kind of edits, I just think it's a good rule of thumb to make a copy of your background layer so that you know that you're making some edits and you can restore the original if you need to. So what I would do is go to the layer palette, click on the little sidebar menu up at the top, and duplicate the layer. And just call it background copy, that's fine. So now I know that whatever I'm going to do right now isn't going to permanently damage the photo. It's just a good habit to get into. Sometimes if you're moving quickly, you just need to grab a little segment off a picture, you can ignore this step. But if you're going to do some extensive edits, it's always a good idea to do that. All right, so let's look at the marquee. First, I've got the rectangle. Let's say I just want to isolate a portion of this picture, like let's say part of her head. So what I'll do is just click and drag with my cursor, making that square around her face. And then let's say I just need that portion of her face. Now that I've selected that square, I can copy, paste, reuse that portion of the picture on something else. So for example, let's say I did copy, which is Command C, or under the edit menu, I did copy. Actually, before I do that, I don't really like this selection. I want to get a little more of her hair in this selection. So let me show you something else. A lot of times while you're working with the Marquee tool, maybe it's not quite right and you need to resize it. Well, one option is to just go back in and redraw the selection. But another, to kind of fine tune it, is under the select menu itself. If you go to the select menu while your marquee is active and you go to transform selection, this is pretty cool. You can take that and notice it gives you these little adjustment bars. So you can actually adjust the size of that selection to increase it or decrease it depending on what you need, resizing it in place without actually adjusting the picture. Notice when I'm doing it right now, it's kind of locked. That's because the proportions are locked. That's what this little chain is doing up here. That's locking the selection so that it's stuck in place. If I uncheck that little chain, I can adjust the selection and move it. Okay, so that size of selection is a little bit better. So now I'm going to commit to this transform, which I made. I need to return to the normal selection. So I can do two things. I can hit return on my keyboard or click the little check mark, and that will stop editing or adjusting the size of the selection. So I'm going to click that little check mark. Now I'm back to normal. So back to copying and pasting. So I'm going to copy this. Command C or Control C on your PC, or under the edit menu, just copy. And that loads a copy of that little selection into my clipboard. Now I'm going to select the picture frame picture and I'm going to hit paste, which is Command V or Control V or edit paste. And now you can see that little selection I made has been pasted into this picture frame. So we're going to come back to this file a little bit later. I just wanted to demonstrate that you could select and copy segments of a photo just by using that marquee. And if you don't care about making a really delicate selection, you just need to get a quick, easy rectangular selection, Marquee tool does it for you. Okay, I'm going to deselect that one. To deselect something or to let go of your selection, you can go to the select menu and use deselect. Or if you get used to the keyboard shortcut, it's Command D or Control D. So Command D, boom, gone. Now, what if I wanted to do some sort of like a little vignette or maybe a softer selection around her? And I'm purposefully avoiding some of the other selection tools. I really want to focus on just the rectangle and the ellipse first. So let's do this. I'm going to switch to the elliptical marquee. And I'm going to try focusing in a little closer on just her face, making kind of an oval. Now again, that selection isn't quite right. I can move it with my mouse to reposition it. And back under that selection menu, if I need to transform it, enlarge it a little bit, I can use transform selection. And I can stretch it a little bit. Try to get it out to the edges of her hair. You'll see why in a minute. Okay, so now that's about the right size. That's going to be perfect for what I want to do. And I'm going to hit return on my keyboard or the check mark up on the top of the control bar. And now I've just got her face selected. So one of the cool things about using a marquee is that it becomes what we call a mask, or it isolates and protects certain areas of the picture from others. Now, it doesn't really look this way, obviously, up front, but the area inside the shape is what is actually selected, and everything else on the outside is ignored. So let's say I wanted to protect the way her face looks, but change the color of the background and not change the color of her face or her hair. So right now, what's happening is I have selected her face and her hair, which means that whatever I edit is going to adjust that. So watch. If I go to the image menu and I select adjustments, and just for fun, I just go to hue and saturation. I'll slide this to the side here. Let's say I start moving that color slider. So you see now how, because that area is inside that oval shape, it's only affecting that interior oval area. Okay? But let's say I want to do the reverse. I would actually like to change the color of the background instead of changing what's inside the circle. So let me show you how to do that. So I'm going to hit cancel here. So what I need to do is actually modify the selection a little bit and then invert it so that I'm selecting the background instead of what's inside the circle. Also, I don't know if you noticed, let me go back to that real quick. Wherever you have your circular line, your marquee, is a harsh edge. Do you see how it's just solid there? Let me zoom in a little bit. See how it's just kind of a solid edge. It's not faded, it's not soft on that edge. So anything inside or outside that selection is going to be a pretty bold line. It's going to be a pretty obvious cut to that edge. So that's also a problem I want to address. So that's something called feathering. Right now that circular marquee is going to be pixel by pixel and it's going to make a harsh edge. But I want to feather it so it softens it, so it fades between one side and the other. So that's an adjustment I can make under the select menu, and that's under what we call modify. It's also available on the control bar. If you notice up at the top there is a little feather. What do you call it? A little feather input box where you can type in the amount of feathering you want per pixel. So if you can kind of gauge in your mind that this image happens to be like 1,500 pixels wide by about 2,000 pixels tall. So if I would like a fade to travel across, you know, a small portion of that picture, usually you might say something like, I'm going to make that feather about 50 pixels wide. So I'm going to go ahead and just type into that little feather box 50 pixels, 50 px right there. I didn't see any change to the selection marquee. Nothing visible indicates that change was made, but I did feather it by 50 pixels, and you'll see the result when I change the adjustment now. So I'm going to go back to that image adjustment, hue and saturation, and now watch what happens when I change the color. Absolutely nothing. Well done. I missed a step. Let's do it this way. I'm going to go to select, modify, feather. This time I'm going to type in 50 here and click OK. All right. So here's my problem. When I typed 50 pixels up into the feather box here, I should have drawn a new marquee. That would have applied the feather to that new marquee. Typing it in here didn't actually adjust the marquee that was already active on my screen. I had to go to the select menu and do modify feather to get it to work. Here's what I mean. Let's look at the image adjustments, hue and saturation again, and now adjust it. There we go. That's what I was looking for. You see how the feather now fades into the background? Doesn't look quite so harsh on the edge. There we go. You can kind of see it now. That's because I did the feathering. All right. I'm going to hit cancel again. One of the things I mentioned a little bit earlier was invert. Like, let's say I want to make the adjustment apply to the outside instead of the inside of the circle. That is also under the select menu. So you go select inverse. Now, don't know if you noticed that, but we went from having just a circular marquee to now a rectangular marquee appeared on the outside of the picture. I think the best way to kind of demonstrate this is quickly, I'm going to do this just so you can see. I'm not going to expect you to follow this part exactly, but when you have the interior selection made, you get something like this when you're selecting what's within the boundary. Instead, if I go select inverse, and now watch what I'm actually selecting. I'm selecting the outside. So when you're selecting the positive space, you just have the circle. When you're selecting the negative space, it adds this additional rectangle around the outside edge because it's selecting everything else. So I'm sure that made it just a whole lot more clear. But while the selection is active, I'm going to go back to the Maryland picture and try that hue and saturation on the background by itself to see what it does. So now I'm going to do hue and saturation, adjust that coloring in the background, and you can see how I can even make it desaturated. I can go extreme on the color. So that's a nifty way to select a portion of the picture and then invert it so that you're selecting the background. And sometimes it's easier when adjusting pictures to select something in the foreground using the selection tools, but what you're really after is what's in the background. And by selecting the easiest thing first, you invert it and you actually get what you intended to select later. All right, so that's some of the basics of using the circle, the ellipse, and the rectangle marquee tool. Now let's talk about the move tool a little bit. I already showed you how we could select a portion of this picture and take it into another one. Let's do that and do some resizing and fooling around with it and show you what can be done. So if I'm going to take this Maryland picture and I'm going to fit it into that picture frame that I have in the other file, I'm going to go back to my marquee tool and switch to the rectangle. And I'm going to go ahead and just make a selection of a portion of her picture. And this time I'm going, similar to the proportion of the original. I'm just leaving out a little bit of the background. So I'm going to make that, and now I'm going to copy it. If you remember, under the edit menu, if you don't, it's edit copy or Command C. I'm going to go to the picture frame file, and I'm going to go ahead and hide that original we copied in there because I don't actually want to adjust that one. In fact, I could even delete it on the layer palette. I can click the little trash can and say goodbye. Now I'm going to paste the original one, or the new copy, into my file. Okay, now what I want to do is actually move and resize this picture. So I'm going to go to the Edit menu, and I'm going to select Transform. Under the Edit menu, this is different than transforming the selection. Remember, we had the Transform Marquee option under the Select menu. That's to adjust the selection area. Instead, under the Edit menu, what I'm actually doing is transforming the image itself. So under Edit, Transform, and Scale, I can now adjust the size of this selection and reposition it using the Move tool. The Move tool is the little back and forth crisscross arrow up at the top, and that allows me to move the image inside the window frame. And then under Edit, I can go back again to Transform and Scale. And this is one of those new things with Photoshop that has been changed recently, which always throws me. Forever, I mean, like for the past 30 years, Photoshop, you have had to hold the Shift key on your keyboard to adjust an image so that it remains in proportion. Otherwise, you would squish and stretch your image if you were transforming it and scaling it. They flipped it. So now you don't have to press a button at all. Anything you will remain in proportion unless you hold Shift. So it's like the reverse now. So if that's happening to you and you want to resize it, you have to hold Shift, and that will allow you to stretch it. So it's like the complete opposite of what it used to be. That being said, don't stretch your pictures. They always look terrible when you do that. I mean, if I'm trying to stretch it and just make it fit the space, that's always a bad idea. So don't do that. You want to keep your pictures in a proportion. Okay, so I'm backing up a little bit till I get back to where she's normal. Okay, so now I can scale and stretch the picture till I get it in the ballpark. Now what I thought would be interesting for this is to make it look like it has a little vignette. So I'm going to resize it so it's a little bit smaller than the open area of the photo, of the mat in the picture frame. And I'm going to use the elliptical marquee, and I'm going to draw a elliptical area around her. Okay. And I need to remember that I am going to go to the Select menu, and I'm going to modify my selection, and I'm going to add another feather to this because I want to soften the edge, make it kind of like an old school vignette. So I'm going to feather the edge. 50 pixels seemed like it did good. And then now I am going to invert the selection, because what I'm going to do is remove the background area of this placed photo, this cropped in picture. So I'm going to go to the Select menu, and I'm going to go Inverse. Now, I want to remove a portion of this selected picture. Quickest way to do that is delete. You could try to use the eraser and erase it out. Don't want to bother with that. I've already made my selection. I've feathered the selection. So now I just press delete on my keyboard, and it goes away. And so that extra portion of that picture has faded away. Now, it so happens there's a couple little image segments here that are still there, like this harsh line from the edge of the photo. I could use the eraser on that if I wanted to. Come over here with the eraser and then change to the softened edge eraser. Increase the size a little bit. Maybe brush over that edge a little bit to get that to disappear. Okay. And then I could further resize this a little bit if I wanted to. I could go to the Edit menu, and I could do Transform and Scale, shrink it down even more. And now I've got that little vignette inside my picture frame. Now, because this image is isolated on its own layer, I could do an image adjustment to this. I could I could try hue and saturation on it. Let's say I change the hue a little bit, or I increase the saturation or decrease the saturation, increase the lightness, fade it. You know, any number of things I could do adjusting that photo just by isolating it on that layer, having copied and pasted it with the Marquee tool. All right, so hopefully that gives you a couple ideas on how to use the Marquee tool and how to copy, select, transform, scale, paste things in your pictures. Look back for another video where I get into some of the more detailed selection tools, such as, you know, the quick selection, lasso, and magic wand. All right, thanks for listening. See you next time.